From KUOW in Seattle, welcome to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. We're going to get right to it today with a shot of caffeine and labor politics. If you got your coffee from a Starbucks this morning, it may have been prepared by a unionized barista. According to the Seattle Times, at least 33 Starbucks in Washington have unions, including the cafe at the company's headquarters in SoDo and the Reserve Roastery on Capitol Hill. It's the result of an organizing effort that began a few years ago across the country in Buffalo, New York. In 2021, Starbucks workers in that city kicked off a renewed push to unionize those coffee shops. The following year, the store on Elmwood Avenue was the first to vote to unionize. Jazz Brissack worked at that store, and they were one of the lead organizers on that campaign. They began working with unions while they were a student at the University of Mississippi. They've since been involved with campaigns for workers at Tesla and Ben & Jerry's, among other places. And Brissack wrote a book about their push to unionize at Starbucks. It came out this year, and it's called Get on the Job and Organize, Standing Up for a Better Workplace and a Better World. And Jazz Brissack joins me now in studio. Hi, Jazz. Welcome to Soundside.
Thanks so much for having me.
So your early experience as a union organizer featured a pretty crushing defeat. You write in the book about your work with the Nissan plant in Mississippi. That vote failed. That was with the UAW. What kind of lessons did you take from that failed effort?
Well, I learned everything that I know, really, in a lot of ways from the Nissan campaign. I didn't grow up knowing that unions were even something that still existed, that union organizing was something that you could do. I learned about Eugene Debs and labor history at 16 by going into this historical rabbit hole. And it really spoke to me. And I was really enthralled by, the stories about the industrial workers of the world and the Haymarket martyrs. But I thought this was something that had existed, 100 years ago, and that really there was no way to get involved with. And so I ended up at the University of Mississippi, and I had a labor journalism professor who was like, hey, unions still exist. You can get involved. You should meet my friend. And so I started working with Richard Bensinger on the Nissan campaign in Canton, Mississippi. And it was really eye-opening for me to see why the workers were trying to organize. One of the main issues of the campaign was health and safety, and a worker named Eric Whiting had died in the plant after collapsing across the assembly line. And, one of my jobs working on the campaign was compiling a health and safety report and talking to workers who'd had everything from, carpal tunnel to exposure to toxic chemicals. And that was really solidifying of, the ways that organizing a union is truly a struggle for workers' lives and, kind of goes beyond the, wages and benefits and working conditions kind of, issues. Although I guess that is a working condition. But how fundamental this right is and how having a voice in the workplace can, be transformative for workers. So it also showed me what companies will do to fight the union. And Nissan was incredibly opposed to allowing workers to organize in a unconstrained way. And the final thing that I learned was that a union really needs to hold a company accountable when they violate workers' right to organize. And we call this bringing the hammer down on the company to hold them accountable and to ensure that workers can have a fair election. Richard Bensinger had developed what he called the fair election principles, which were a set of guidelines that companies should follow, where, they wouldn't threaten workers. If they had an anti-union meeting, there would be equal time for a pro-union meeting. And if somebody was fired, for example, or retaliated against, there would be an expedited process to decide whether that was unfair retaliation instead of, the current NLRB process, which can take years. And so Nissan, of course, did not sign that. We would use those same principles at Starbucks and Ben & Jerry's, which did sign them. But that became sort of crystallizing of, a union should really put resources into holding a company accountable through a boycott, through any kind of public pressure campaign, companies that didn't respect the right to organize. And the UAW didn't really make Nissan pay any consequences.
The UAW had sort of switched tactics, decided to kind of lay off the idea of so much public pressure. And you, as an organizer on the ground, saw how much that kind of made the effort dissolve, like made it have less oomph, and ultimately the vote fails. At that point, you are in the process of finishing school. You become a Rhodes Scholar, so you're away from the country for a little bit. But eventually you come back to this effort in Buffalo, and that involves unionizing baristas. And the first move is not Starbucks, right? It's like a local chain called Spot Coffee. How big of a deal was it that in Buffalo at the time there was, the unionized chain Spot, which kind of provided a framework or a blueprint for then moving to a much bigger deal, which was Starbucks?
Yeah, I mean, I think there wouldn't have been a Starbucks Workers United in the way that there became Starbucks Workers United without Spot Coffee and Gimme Coffee and the other coffee shop organizing in upstate New York. I mean, obviously, there were previous union efforts at Starbucks. There had been unionized stores in the 80s that Howard Schultz systematically decertified the union at.
Yeah, that was a surprise. I didn't realize that the Seattle stores in the 80s had a union.
Yes.
And that was something that then was decertified in the 90s. So this was like a full circle moment in some ways for Starbucks. But yeah, take it from there.
Yeah, no, I mean, Howard has written about how he views unions as a referendum on his own leadership. And if he's doing a good job, people won't want to unionize. And so it was very personal to him to decertify the union then, and it's very personal to him to try to keep the union out and crush the union now, which we'll come back to. But I think the organizing at Starbucks grew out of this geographic campaign where we weren't just trying to organize hot shops. Gimme Coffee in 2017 became the only currently unionized coffee shop chain in the U.S., and, again, there were previous ones, but the companies had either closed or gotten rid of the unions. And we learned very quickly that you couldn't negotiate a really strong contract. You couldn't win healthcare at a company that didn't have healthcare if you were organizing one store that was competing with all of these others in a market with 0% union density, where, the industry is really built on very thin profit margins and very low labor costs. And so Spot Coffee became what was at that time the biggest unionized restaurant coffee chain in the U.S. And then, Colectivo was organizing. There were other coffee shop campaigns happening. And Starbucks workers in Buffalo often had a revolving door with Spot and with some of these other organizing coffee shops where people would, work at one and then work at the other, or had partners and roommates who were working at others. And so I actually didn't initially decide to get a job at Starbucks. I initially got in touch with the former partner of one of the Spot Coffee union leaders who was working at the University at Buffalo location. And they were really interested in organizing a union for a variety of reasons, including, the kind of standard working condition issues, but then also Starbucks had really gotten into their coffee with a cop program. And Benny, the Starbucks worker, did not want to have to serve cops their free coffee. And so they wanted protections for being able to take a stance like that. But very quickly after organizing conversations with their coworkers, Benny was fired, allegedly because they were cursing on the job. But I can confirm from personal experience, if Starbucks fired workers for cursing, they would have 0 workers.
So you believe it was a pretense of union busting, pretense to fire Benny at that point?
Exactly. And, the Trump NLRB was in place at that time, the first time around, and we didn't have a way to prove that Starbucks had known that Benny was having organizing conversations, but there's no doubt in my mind that that was a pretext. So, yeah, that was right before, or actually while I was in the UK. I'd come back and was trying to help Benny and their coworkers start that effort. And then I came back, mid-pandemic and decided that rather than having more Starbucks workers stick their necks out and potentially get fired without being able to prove that they had been part of an organizing effort, that I would use the tactics that I'd been learning about through the Inside Organizer School, which I'd been involved with a couple years before when Richard and a collective of organizers put that together, and actually get a job with the goal of organizing.
Let me ask you about that. So That is a practice known as salting or being a salt, which is you are already looking at a company and saying they should have a union. And as an outsider, the way that you make that happen is you get a job there. And the practice is known as salting. And then there's also peppers. And the peppers are the inside organizers. Why is salting an important practice, especially with a company like Starbucks? Why did you think that that was the way to go? To get, instead of what you did for Nissan, which was act as an outside organizer, convince the workers, kind of, distribute flyers, things like that, you actually go and you work in the trenches and you learn how to steam the milk and take the trash out and do all this stuff in the store. Why was that an important practice?
Well, a couple of things. One is I'm a labor history nerd, and I think in the beginnings of what we think of as the beginnings of the labor movement, when we were achieving mass organizing, there was not really this sharp distinction between an inside organizer in the workplace and an outside organizer, the staffer, with unions, like the IWW, but also with unions like the United Auto Workers and a lot of the other major unions. They were organized by folks who were working the jobs, and there wasn't this sharp distinction. So get on the job and organize is the slogan of the industrial workers of the world from 1917, because they were encouraging their members to get jobs. Everybody's got to have a job. So they were trying to encourage people to strategically decide, where they were going to work in order to advance the labor movement. And I wanted that experience of organizing my own workplace so that I could, understand what workers go through and know, for future use, like how to support people who were either salting or organizing from the inside. And I think it's really kind of a blurred line because, I know a lot of folks who, would organize any workplace that they would work in. And, that was true for me, although, of course, I was also very much interested in expanding the barista organizing project. But I think it's also really important, companies will do anything that they can to crush unions, whether that's legal, illegal, it doesn't really matter. The law is not very strong for protecting workers, and it can take years for people to get their jobs back. Or like Benny, maybe they don't have the means of proving that the company did it for that reason, and so they never get their jobs back. And salting is one of the best ways to preempt the anti-union campaigns that companies will run and to build the momentum and the relationships to actually have a successful campaign in the works before the company finds out.
Did you ever worry that it would ultimately come out that you arrived at the store, you became an employee in order to start the organizing effort, and that your fellow employees would find that out and feel manipulated because you couldn't be honest with them at first?
No, I could not be honest with them at first because I was very worried that the same thing that had happened to Benny would happen to me and that Starbucks would fire me. But when we started having conversations with coworkers, by this time I'd recruited more friends who moved to Buffalo and got jobs at Starbucks with the goal of organizing.
The salt was being sprinkled all over in the Buffalo area Starbucks scene.
Exactly. We had 10 folks across the 20 corporate stores. And, at that time, Starbucks had a drink and food markout. And so we would go to other stores and, get our food and drink markouts and have conversations with folks. But when I started really having organizing conversations, I didn't say the word union for 8 months because I didn't want to blow that cover. But I started telling people, that I worked with the union, that I'd worked on the Spot Coffee campaign, that I was still doing organizing work. And so I was a pretty public about what I was doing. I think using the word salting was kind of, unnecessary jargon because, again, I think it's a very blurry line between being a union organizer and being someone who would organize any workplace that you worked in. But I think, I was able to tell my coworkers about my background. And in fact, that helped people think, oh, maybe this is serious because Spot Coffee was successful. And so maybe we could do that too.
Why do you think this was the time for a union to be successful? When, more established unions had maybe looked at this and passed it over. You mentioned that, Benny had been kind of talking about organizing and had been fired. Why do you think that the union worked this time at the Starbucks stores? Why now?
I think it's a combination of factors. I think one factor is that a lot of the labor union establishment, and I mean institutionally, the folks making decisions about what organizing campaigns they were going to put resources into, didn't think that Starbucks was a good target, or even that the broader, food service industry was a good target. And they didn't think that you could win, NLRB elections store by store at a company that had 10,000 corporate locations and get anywhere. And
I mean, these are places where there's a lot of turnover. Some people work part-time. It seems like a difficult place to organize, to have any kind of consistency, at least.
No, exactly. I mean, I think those are challenges that we had to deal with and contend with. And, a lot of folks said that the timing was because of the pandemic, but the pandemic was a double-edged sword because you had so many people, taking advantage of a tighter labor market. This was the height of Starbucks and other companies claiming nobody wants to work anymore, but people didn't want to work in those kind of exploitive conditions. And so we had the problem of, as we were trying to build relationships with folks who would become our organizing committee, people kept quitting because, they could suddenly get a job somewhere else. So I don't think the pandemic, helped us with organizing in some ways, although obviously it certainly made the realities of what companies would do for profit and would put workers through for profit more evident to some folks. But I think we were really lucky to have, Workers United in upstate New York, this little region of a little union that was willing to put resources behind this and commit to a geographic project where it didn't matter if you were organizing the 10-person coffee shop at Remedy House or, taking on Starbucks. It was part of the same project to change what this industry would look like and to try to build union density and, bring all the coffee bosses to the same table. And obviously the campaign started growing nationally, and that vision of the Buffalo Industrial Union sort of shifted by necessity as we had workers in Arizona and in Tennessee and everywhere else starting to organize. But I think it was the combination of having a union that would really take it on seriously. And then also, I think there is a generational uprising where people have seen that, we're not going to have a better quality of life than our parents. In fact, most of us are having a worse quality of life than our parents. And where people see, the connections between all of these different issues, whether that's racial justice or LGBTQ rights or the climate crisis or, other issues like Palestine, and see the labor movement as a way to bring all of these issues together and to also have a democratic organization where workers can actually exercise power and advocate for all of these different things. So I think, it was sort of a combined effort.
That's Jaz Brissac, author of Get on the Job and Organize, Standing Up for a Better Workplace and a Better World. We're going to be right back and talk more about their work unionizing Starbucks workers and the role of the labor movement overall in America today. You're listening to Soundside. We'll be right back on KUOW. This is Soundside on KUOW. I'm talking with union organizer Jaz Brissac. In Buffalo, New York, just a few years ago, they helped lead a successful push to organize Starbucks workers. And that union, Starbucks Workers United, has since organized hundreds of stores across the country. Jaz, in your telling, the effort by Starbucks corporate to undermine the union was pretty scorched earth. Top executives were on the ground in Buffalo. The CEO at the time, Howard Schultz, visited for a very poorly reviewed speech, and not just by you, but poorly reviewed by a lot of people. He talked about Holocaust survivors and somehow compared that to his philosophy on the way he wanted to treat people in his business and his life. You write that this moment was a turning point, this speech by Schultz, for a lot of workers at the time who might have been on the fence about the union or who had maybe started to lose interest. When Schultz came into town to speak and you all had to go to this hotel ballroom and listen, first of all, did it surprise you that Schultz himself was so focused on defeating the union? Because he reportedly came back as CEO in part to do this, to try to stop the union.
I mean, on the one hand, we thought, Starbucks brands itself as a different kind of company, says that they're so progressive on all of these issues. There was one part of our brains or our collective brain that thought that, Starbucks might actually sign the fair election principles and recognize the union, not because they wanted a union, but because they didn't want to be a union buster and, taint the image that they had worked hard to curate of being progressive and supporting all of these various social justice causes. At the same time, there was also the threat of Starbucks corporate that had given Littler Mendelsohn, their union busting law firm, which was also Nissan's union busting law firm, their diversity and inclusion awards prior to the union campaign. And so, there were competing pieces of that image, I think. And it became very evident very quickly that this was extremely personal to Howard, that he sent, Rossian Williams, the president of Starbucks North America, one of his, top officials, to Buffalo for 4 months to fight the union, where she was sweeping our floors and, running trash and then pulling people into one-on-one meetings. But the night of that speech was probably like one of the greatest nights of my life, which I did not know it would be going in. But yeah, I mean, sitting there and listening to Howard, talk about the shame and the scars of having grown up poor in a room of workers who were mostly poor, who did not feel ashamed or scarred by their experiences.
And when he's worth billions of dollars.
No, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. His net worth on that night was $4.8 billion. And, he was talking about how terrible his dad's work life had been. And everybody was like, oh my God, Howard's dad needed a union. And then about, like you said, the Holocaust and how prisoners in Auschwitz had shared their blankets and how that was what he was doing at Starbucks. And, there's a cliche that the boss is the best organizer, but Howard truly did us so many favors that night. Like, workers who had been on the fence about joining the union were literally signing cards, like, as soon as Howard had finished speaking. And Gianna Reeve, who was one of our organizing committee leaders, stood up and very courageously asked Howard to sign the fair election principles, and he fled the room. And that really illustrated, Rossian and other corporate executives were physically pushing Gianna back into their chair. And workers saw exactly how corporate was responding to someone like Gianna, who was, speaking about how, like Howard, they just wanted the best for the company. And then Howard was avoiding even interacting with this. And so that was truly a high mark of the campaign.
Just to take him at face value and what he's saying, and I'll let you respond. It seems like this is a guy who did build a really successful brand, and compared to other food service, retail, cafe type places. I mean, in the book, you even at one point have somebody say Panera bread, for example, is much worse to work at than a Starbucks.
It's true. I've done it.
You've done it. So, Starbucks in terms of food service, and I've worked food service before, has a reputation as being one of the better employers. They tend to pay over minimum wage. They tend to have, different benefits, education benefits, things like that workers can access. So in his mind, like Howard Schultz, he is like building a progressive company by comparison that is pretty good to workers. So is it fair that he's saying you don't need a union? We are doing things as a company that are good for you and that we're all doing this together. The word partner is like used a lot to refer to employees. What do you think about that and kind of responding? I know that he's also kind of easy to make fun of because in Seattle, a lot of us roll our eyes about Howard Schultz and selling the Sonics and things like that. But, to take that in a good faith way, like, what's your response to that?
Well, I said a lot of times during the campaign, and it was true, that we liked working at Starbucks. I liked working at Starbucks. It was much better than Panera Bread and, other food service jobs. And I think Howard couldn't get over the fact that people might like their jobs and also want a union and also want democracy in the workplace and also want a true partnership, and that the partnership wasn't designed to drag down Starbucks or taint their image, that we wanted a very positive relationship and we wanted, to truly fulfill the Starbucks mission and values that they said they believed in. And I think they obviously responded to the campaign in a very scorched earth way with a lot of negativity, and then, engaged in things like firing workers, including the entire organizing committee in Memphis, closing stores, including every store in Ithaca, New York, when all 3 stores voted to unionize. And so, they started making the campaign much more hostile because of those actions. But from the very beginning, all we asked them was, to come together in the spirit of true partnership and really allow workers to have a say and a voice and to negotiate. And I think that was really what the campaign was all about. Our slogan was partners becoming partners. And the way we were trying to run the campaign was this very grassroots, very democratic, workers at the bargaining table, not having, Starbucks was always trying to paint the union as a third party. And we were very conscious of that and very intentional about, the social media, the communications, the press strategy.
You were outside agitators to Starbucks. That was the terminology. Outside agitators.
No, exactly.
And that you weren't really partners.
No, exactly. And I mean, of course, that the outside agitators trope goes back to the Civil War. It goes back to, people saying that, enslaved people were getting riled up by outside agitators, and then unions must be created by outside agitators because otherwise people would be content to work under the conditions that they were being expected to work in. But Howard said to the Senate Help Committee when Bernie Sanders summoned him to testify, about salting, that if that wasn't a nefarious thing to do, he didn't know what was. And he even said, we had no salts outside of Buffalo, but he tried to say that when the Seattle roastery unionized, that like a third of the workers, 27 out of 90 workers, were salts, which was not true. But he just couldn't understand that workers at the company, including workers at, the stores that he was a regular at, or like the roastery where it was his pet project, that workers might actually want a union.
So in February 2024, Starbucks announced that it would come to the table and commit to a foundational framework, quote unquote, to reach a contract agreement with Workers United. Still no contract, though, to this day. It's been since the union effort started in 21 till today. There's a mediator working with both parties now. Workers at the store right down the street on University Way picketed during the annual shareholders meeting earlier this year. They said that they're frustrated about problems like low staffing, low pay. One of our reporters here, Noelle Gasca, reported and talked to some workers there. What are the biggest sticking points between these negotiations and a contract? Like, what's the holdup?
Well, I think a couple of things. One is the campaign is quite different now than it was in the very beginning. And I think we're seeing some of the same issues that prevented Nissan workers from being able to vote in a fair election, which was the union wasn't willing enough to, enforce a boycott, enforce the hammer, bring down the hammer on the company and win the right to organize. And so, I write in the book about the fights that we had over, bargaining and boycotting Starbucks, and some of the top union leadership never thought that we would, be able to pull off a boycott or that was the right strategy. And I think the reason that Starbucks came back to the table to reach this framework was the pressure that they faced with this global boycott, where after they had retaliated against the union for standing in solidarity with Palestine in October of 2023. And we didn't do that because we thought it was tactically going to result in this global boycott of Starbucks. We did that because Starbucks workers, overwhelmingly support Palestine and see solidarity as something that, you should have, whether that's with trans folks or, with Black Lives Matter or with Palestine, or you name the issue. Like, it's the right thing to do. But out of that, Starbucks had to deal with some of their image problems. They lost I think $11 or $12 billion in 2 weeks of market value, and they came back to the table. I think keeping that pressure of the boycott on the company is really important. At Spot Coffee, we'd had to declare a community boycott when they fired workers for organizing, and we didn't lift that boycott until we got the first contract. And I think keeping the pressure on Starbucks is really critical. They think, I believe that they think that they can wait out the union. Now with the Trump NLRB, there's a new sheriff in town. They switched CEOs yet again from Lakshman, who had, been the one to oversee the creation of this framework, to Brian Nickel, who comes from Chipotle, which has also been a major union buster when workers organized in Lansing, Michigan, and they closed a store in Maine to prevent unionization. And so, yeah, I think obviously, Starbucks still has a lot of the same anti-union beliefs that they've had all along. And the union has an obligation to keep the pressure on the company.
But you would like to see Workers United use the threat of a boycott more strongly in this negotiation process. You think that they haven't been pushing that hard enough?
Yeah, exactly. I think, the union never fully endorsed the boycott around, our stand in solidarity with Palestine. But I think that put tons of pressure on the company, financially and image-wise. And I think, from the very beginning of the campaign, we believed that, Starbucks' weak points were their brand image and the potential impacts of a consumer boycott. And so I think, that's still the key to winning a contract.
I think the most recent headlines I saw was that the Starbucks union had rejected an offer from the company that amounted to a raise of at least 2% annually. Now, there have been other agreements that have come about related to healthcare, different issues. But this pay issue specifically, I guess my question is what is sufficient in order to have the union, agree to go forward? I know you don't speak for them or anything like that, but what would be enough, I suppose, for this to get unstuck?
I think that the decision of what would be enough to reach a contract is something that the bargaining committee is going to have to decide. I haven't been formally on the campaign for a little while, although I'm still a fired worker waiting for reinstatement and still fighting for that.
Are there any other big elements besides pay that you think are holding things up or that you think need to be addressed in this negotiation?
My understanding is that most of the other issues have been resolved.
Yeah, so it's mostly pay. This has been just a really huge effort. And at this point, it's something like 10,000 employees are represented by a union. Hundreds of stores are unionized. But it's been a long and costly one. I mean, you ended up getting fired. There's been a lot of people who have kind of cycled through and put in a lot of time and effort. After all these years, can you point to any concrete benefits that the union has won or union organizing has won for Starbucks workers, even though there's not a contract yet?
Several. From the very beginning of the campaign, Starbucks used a carrot and a stick strategy and sometimes used the carrot as the stick. But there were benefits that Starbucks had not given for 50 years of their existence. When we started the campaign, they were celebrating their 50th anniversary of existence. Things like seniority pay, where Michelle Eisen, my coworker who had been at Starbucks for 12 years, was making 16 cents more than a brand new hire. No respect for that seniority. Things like credit card tipping. Starbucks, I think, didn't want to pay the extra fees on credit card tips, and so just didn't allow customers to leave tips, which averages about $5 an hour for workers. And so to try to prevent the non-union stores from organizing, Starbucks gave all of those workers the benefits that we were asking for at the bargaining table and then said, now don't unionize, the union stores can't get this because we would have to bargain about this. That's not legal, but, the law is not very strong. And so a lot of these cases are still pending.
That's one thing you do highlight so well in the book is the fact that, something might go run afoul of labor law or, be appealed up to the NLRB, but the process takes so long. And for most people, the redress for all of these issues is really, in some cases, more difficult, than just kind of moving on. And that's a big problem with labor law today. Am I capturing that accurately? Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's why the fair election principles are so important, because the law really there's no penalties for the first, only remedies. And then it can take so long for people to win reinstatement or, get back pay. And in the meantime, people's lives can be destroyed by the union busting. Part of the thesis of your book is that if you have a workplace, you should organize. Everyone should organize. I should say here that as a host at KUOW alongside my producers, the reporters who work at the station, the announcers. We're all members of SAG-AFTRA. So, check mark for us. We have organized and we have a union. We're union represented. But so little of especially the private sector today is organized. And I think that the concessions that unions have been able to negotiate for, especially recently, we covered the Boeing machinists, walkout quite closely most recently. One of the big sticking points for them was to get back their pension, but that is something that's been gone, and that, many economists or labor experts who looked at this said, yeah, it would be great to get the pension back, but that's, probably too far. What's your pitch for organizing today, even as the odds seem really steep and maybe the rewards not as great as they used to be in mid-century America?
I think organizing is our best chance to put society back on a track that leads toward more democratic participation, more equity, more justice, more of a voice for people. And I think especially right now, with AI, with right-wing populism and authoritarianism on the rise, having the experience of democracy in the workplace and actually forcing the boss to negotiate with you on an equal footing is something that transcends, one workplace or one issue and can actually have a very broad societal impact. If we look at labor history, we're in a very similar position to where workers were in the 1920s. Really low unionization. Right now we're below 6% for the first time, since modern labor law. Workers have been losing all of these benefits that are now seen as, relics of a more unionized past. But I think in the 20s, it seemed impossible, too, that, a GM or a General Electric would fall. And they did. And I think people now, especially young folks, but not just young folks, understand that the labor movement unites all of the other causes that we care about, and that if we actually want to build power, nobody's coming to save us. We can't count on the government. We can't count on the NGOs. We can't count on, the philanthropists. We can't count on any of these other institutions. And that actually having democracy in the workplace where most people are spending most of their lives can also translate to a much more just and more democratic society outside of the workplace.
We've been talking with Jaz Brissac, the author of Get on the Job and Organize, Standing Up for a Better Workplace and a Better World. They are one of the original organizers that helped get Starbucks locations in Buffalo, New York, unionized, and that effort then spread across the country, including to here in Seattle. They're also the co-founder of the Inside Organizer School, which trains workers to unionize. A self-described radical. Is that fair to say, Jaz?
I think so.
Self-described radical, Jaz Brissac. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and thanks for sharing your experience as an organizer.
No, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.